What happens when three of the world's most powerful governments have more to lose by finding a missing child than by letting her remain lost? For 17 years, we have been told the story of a stranger in the night, a window left open, and a little girl who vanished without a trace. But what if that story is wrong? What if the investigation was never about finding the truth, but about controlling the narrative? From the forensic dogs who smelled death where police saw nothing, to the crucial DNA tests that were deliberately refused, and the political pressure that silenced the detectives trying to solve the case. This is no longer just a mystery about a disappearance. This is a story about a global chess match, played by those in power, where the pieces are evidence, and the prize is silence. The question isn't who took Madeleine anymore. The real question is, who made sure we would never know? Before we unlock the files that they tried to keep hidden, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. You deserve to hear the truth that has been buried for nearly 2 decades. Let's begin. In the realm of criminal investigation, there exists a concept known as the golden window. It is a fragile, fleeting period of time immediately following the report of a missing child. During these initial hours, the truth is often within reach. Evidence is fresh, memories are sharp, and the timeline has not yet been distorted by the chaos of intervention. If a crime has occurred, the perpetrator is likely still close, and the physical traces of their presence, a footprint in the dust, a fiber on a windowsill, a scent lingering in the air, have not yet been erased. In the case of the disappearance of young Madeleine McCann, this golden window did not just close. It was shattered. What occurred on the evening of May 3, 2007, at the Ocean Club Resort in Praia da Luz was not merely a tragedy, but a procedural collapse that would haunt the investigation for nearly 2 decades. The evening began with a routine that appeared, on the surface, to be structured and safe. Jerry and Kate McCann, along with 7 friends, were dining at the Tapas restaurant, a location situated roughly 55 meters from the apartment where the family was sleeping. This group, later dubbed the Tapas 7, had established a system of rotating checks. The premise was simple. One member of the group would leave the dinner table at regular intervals to walk back to the apartments, listen for crying, or visually confirm the safety of the children. It was a system built on trust and the assumption of safety within a family-oriented resort. However, retrospect would reveal that this system of checks created a timeline that was porous, fragmented, and ultimately impossible to verify with absolute certainty. At roughly 9 in the evening, Jerry McCann conducted his check. He reported seeing Madeleine and her siblings asleep and accounted for. The door to the bedroom, according to his account, was left slightly ajar. He returned to the restaurant, and the dinner continued. Roughly 30 minutes later, another member of the group, Matthew Oldfield, went to check on the children. He listened at the door and heard nothing, assuming silence equated to safety. He did not enter the room far enough to visually confirm Madeleine's presence. This moment would become one of the most scrutinized intervals in the entire case, a period of time where assumptions replaced verification. The breaking point arrived at 10 in the evening. Kate McCann left the table to conduct her own check. Upon entering apartment 5A, she noticed that the door to the sleeping quarters, which Jerry had left slightly ajar, was now wide open. A draft moved through the room. When she looked at the bed, the blankets were turned back, and the space where the little one should have been was empty. The window, according to her initial reaction, was open, and the shutters were raised. The reaction that followed was immediate and visceral. Kate rushed back to the restaurant, not with a quiet concern, but with a frantic declaration that would echo through the years. She is gone. This specific moment marked the end of the normal evening and the beginning of the investigative disaster. In a standard protocol for a missing child, the immediate response should be a complete lockdown. The location where the child was last seen becomes a sterile zone. No one enters, no one exits, and nothing is touched until forensic specialists arrive to map the scene. However, at the Ocean Club that night, the opposite occurred. The alarm raised by Kate McCann did not trigger a containment. It triggered a chaotic influx of people. Panic, though a natural human response, is the enemy of forensics. Following the announcement that Madeleine was missing, a wave of individuals descended upon apartment 5A. This group included not only the parents and the 7 friends, but also resort staff, receptionists, security guards, and even concerned neighbors and bystanders who had heard the commotion. Reports indicate that over 20 different people entered the apartment in the hours following the discovery. They walked through the living area, entered the bedroom, touched surfaces, opened and closed doors, and moved items in a desperate search for the child. From a forensic perspective, the crime scene was being systematically overwritten. Every person who walked across the floor potentially destroyed footprint evidence from an intruder. Every hand that touched a door handle or a window latch overlaid fresh DNA onto existing samples, rendering them useless or complex to separate later. The timeline of the physical environment, the exact state of the curtains, the position of the toys, the angle of the door was lost in a flurry of well-intentioned but destructive activity. The local police, the GNR, were notified, but they were a patrol force, not a specialized criminal investigation unit. When they arrived, the scene was already compromised. The critical separation between witnesses and the scene was not enforced. The friends were not separated for individual statements immediately, allowing their narratives to blend and merge in the shared trauma of the moment. The specialized criminal police, the PJ, would not arrive until later, by which time the golden window had effectively passed. This initial failure to secure apartment 5 created a void where hard facts should have been. Without a pristine crime scene, investigators were left to rely on witness testimony, a form of evidence that is notoriously unreliable and subject to change. The question of how an abductor could enter and exit without leaving a trace became harder to answer, not because they were a ghost, but because the traces they might have left were trampled under the feet of a panic-stricken crowd. Furthermore, the immediate assumption of abduction shaped the physical search. The focus was directed outward, scanning the streets and the resort perimeter, while the apartment itself was treated more as a meeting point for the frantic search party than as the primary source of evidence. The opportunity to use advanced forensic tools to test for biological traces or subtle signs of a staged scene was diminished with every passing minute and every new visitor who crossed the threshold. As the sun rose over Praia da Luz the following morning, the reality of the situation began to settle. A child had vanished into the night, leaving behind no weapon, no clear witness, and a crime scene that had been irrevocably contaminated. The investigation had not yet truly begun, but the ability to solve the case had already been severely handicapped. If the first error in the disappearance of Madeleine McCann was the failure to lock down the timeline, the second and perhaps more fatal error was the systematic destruction of the physical environment. In modern criminology, a location where a crime is suspected to have occurred is treated with a reverence bordering on religious. It is a sanctuary of truth, where the microscopic debris of an event waits to be read like a map. But apartment 5A was never afforded this protection. Instead, it became a compromised vessel, its forensic integrity unraveling with every passing second in the early hours of May 4, 2007, when the first officers from the GNR, the local patrol force, arrived at the scene. They stepped into a situation that was already spiraling out of control. Standard procedure dictates that the immediate area must be cordoned off with tape, establishing a clear boundary between the investigation and the public. A log should be started instantly to record the name of every individual who crosses that line. Yet, at the Ocean Club, this boundary did not exist. The apartment was not treated as a crime scene. It was treated as a crisis center. The contamination was total. In the critical hours following the alarm, reports suggest that upwards of 20 people moved through the property. This was not limited to the parents and their friends. Resort staff, seeking to be helpful, entered the premises. Neighbors, drawn by the noise and distress, wandered in. Even the police officers themselves, lacking the specialized equipment of forensic technicians, walked through the rooms without protective footwear or suits. The implications of this traffic are devastating to the forensic narrative. Consider the floor of the children's bedroom. If an abductor had entered through the window, as was the prevailing theory, they would likely have left footprints. These prints could have told investigators the size of the intruder's shoe, the brand, the weight distribution, and the direction of travel. They could have indicated whether the intruder hesitated or moved with purpose. But under the trampling feet of 24 people, any such delicate traces were obliterated. The floor became a canvas painted over so many times that the original image was lost forever. Touch DNA. The microscopic skin cells left behind when a person handles an object was equally compromised. In a preserved scene, a handle on a window or the rail of a bed would be swabbed immediately to isolate foreign genetic material. However, in the chaos, family members and friends touched surfaces repeatedly. They checked the shutters, they opened cupboards, they handled blankets. This layering of innocent DNA over potential perpetrator DNA created a complex biological mixture that even advanced technology would struggle to untangle. The chemical signals of a stranger were effectively drowned out by the biological noise of the familiar. Furthermore, the integrity of the scene's layout was destroyed. The question of whether the window shutters were forced open or lifted from the inside became a matter of fierce debate. Had the scene been sealed, technicians could have examined the mechanism for microscopic tool marks or dust disturbances that would prove forced entry. Instead, the shutters were manipulated by multiple people before they could be forensically examined. The position of the curtains, the state of the door, and the placement of the favorite soft toy were all altered before they could be documented in their original state. The specialized criminal investigators from the PJ arrived hours later, inheriting a scene that was scientifically largely useless. They were forced to work backward, trying to subtract the known contamination from the few scraps of evidence that remained. It was an impossible mathematical equation. The sanctuary had been breached, not just by the person who took the child, but by the very people trying to find her. The physical reality of apartment 5A had been rewritten, leaving investigators to chase ghosts in a room full of echoes. While the physical evidence was being eroded in the apartment, an equally complex problem was emerging in the testimonies of the witnesses. The fracture of time. In any investigation, the timeline is the spine of the case. It dictates what is possible and what is impossible. It clears suspects and implicates others. But in the case of the Tapas 7, the timeline was not a solid structure. It was fluid, contradictory, and filled with gaps that 17 years of scrutiny have failed to close. The core of the timeline rested on the checking system devised by the group. The friends were dining at the Tapas restaurant, a location roughly 55 meters from the apartments. They had agreed to take turns leaving the table to check on their sleeping children. On paper, this seemed like a responsible and organized plan. In practice, it created a disjointed series of snapshots that failed to form a coherent movie of the evening. The first major fracture lies in the discrepancy of time itself. The witnesses could not agree on the precise timing of events. Some members of the group recalled dinner starting at 8:30 in the evening. Others remembered it being closer to 9. In an investigation where minutes can determine the opportunity for a crime, a 30-minute variance is a canyon. If the timeline shifts forward or backward, alibis crumble and opportunities vanish. One of the most critical checks was performed by Matthew Oldfield at approximately 9:30 in the evening. Oldfield offered to check on the McCann children, as well as his own. His account of this moment is haunting in its ambiguity. He walked to apartment 5A and found the bedroom door open. He paused, listening for any sound of distress. Hearing silence and seeing a sliver of light, he assumed the children were sleeping peacefully. He did not step fully into the room. He did not lean over the beds to visualize the children. He listened, assumed, and left. This moment represents a terrifying possibility. Was Madeleine already gone when Oldfield stood at the threshold? Was the silence he heard the silence of an empty bed, or the silence of a perpetrator hiding in the shadows mere feet away? Or was she still there, sleeping, only to be taken in the narrow 30-minute window between his check and Kate McCann's discovery at 10 o'clock? Because Oldfield did not physically see the child, his testimony serves only to confirm that the room was quiet, not that it was safe. Then there is the matter of the Tanner sighting, a piece of evidence that steered the investigation for years. Jane Tanner, another member of the group, claimed that during her check at roughly 9:15, she saw a man carrying a child walking away from the resort. For a long time, this was the primary image of the abductor. However, this sighting was not corroborated by anyone else, despite the area being relatively open. Years later, British police would dismiss this sighting, concluding that Tanner had likely seen another tourist carrying his own child from a night creche. If this is true, then the most significant lead of the early investigation was a phantom, a case of mistaken identity that distracted detectives from other avenues for years. Adding to the confusion were the inconsistencies between the statements of the friends. When separated and interviewed, their recollections of who left the table, in what order, and for how long, did not perfectly align. While minor memory lapses are normal, the specific contradictions regarding the checks on apartment 5 had created a fog of war around the critical hour. There was no digital footprint to verify these movements. No CCTV cameras covered the path between the restaurant and the apartment. The entire reconstruction of the crime relied on the memories of people who were consuming alcohol, enjoying a holiday dinner, and not expecting a tragedy. The timeline was built on the quicksand of human memory. As investigators tried to piece together the events of May 3rd, they found that the pieces did not fit. The intervals between checks were irregular. The observations were incomplete. The times were estimates. The fracture in time meant that there was no definitive proof of when Madeleine was taken, or indeed, if the window of opportunity was created by the abductor or inadvertently provided by the relaxed surveillance of the parents. The clock at the Ocean Club kept ticking, but for the investigation, time had become a riddle that no one could solve. In the absence of physical fingerprints or reliable eyewitnesses, the investigation into the disappearance of Madeleine McCann eventually turned to a different kind of observer, one that could not be influenced by politics, emotion, or the passage of time. Months after the initial event, British authorities deployed two highly specialized tools to Praia da Luz, victim recovery dogs. These were not ordinary police canines trained to chase suspects or sniff out narcotics. They were elite biological instruments, conditioned to detect the invisible chemical signatures of human blood and human decomposition. Their arrival marked a pivotal shift in the case, moving the inquiry from the realm of what people said to the realm of what the environment remembered. The two spaniels, known as Eddie and Keela, operated with distinct mandates. Keela was trained to detect vital fluids, even if it had been scrubbed clean or was invisible to the naked eye. Eddie, the victim recovery dog, possessed the rare ability to detect chemical markers, the specific scent released by biological decomposition. The handler, Martin Grime, was an expert in his field, and the dogs had a track record of locating evidence in some of the most complex homicide cases in the United Kingdom. Their presence was intended to rule out the worst-case scenario, that Madeleine had not been abducted, but had died within the apartment. When the dogs were brought into apartment 5A, the environment was ostensibly clean. To the human eye, it was a holiday rental that had been cleaned and re-rented. However, the reaction of the dogs told a different story. In a videotaped inspection that would later be scrutinized by millions, Eddie, the cadaver dog, became agitated in specific areas of the apartment. He alerted behind a sofa and near a wardrobe in the master bedroom, places that had been disturbed during the initial panic, but had supposedly shown no sign of a struggle. More significantly, the blood detection dog, Keela, also signaled in the same vicinity, indicating the presence of microscopic biological traces. The implications were profound. If these alerts were accurate, they suggested that a death had occurred within the walls of apartment 5A. This directly challenged the abduction theory, which posited that an intruder had taken the child from her bed and vanished instantly. The dogs were detecting a scent that, according to forensic science, typically requires a body to lie in place for a period of time, releasing chemicals into the surroundings. The investigation then moved to the vehicles. The dogs were tasked with inspecting a range of cars, including the Renault Scenic that the McCanns had rented weeks after the disappearance. In a lineup of vehicles, the cadaver dog bypassed several cars belonging to others, but stopped and gave a strong alert at the trunk of the McCanns' rental car. This alert suggested that the scent of the departed was present in a vehicle that had not existed in the timeline until 24 days after Madeleine vanished. In a standard criminal investigation, such a finding would be catastrophic for the suspects. It would typically lead to the immediate seizure of the vehicle, intensive forensic dismantling, and a relentless line of questioning regarding the movement of the body. However, in this case, the evidence provided by the dogs was met with fierce resistance. The defense offered by the family and their supporters was one of cross-contamination. They argued that the scent could have been transferred from clothing that had been in contact with the deceased in a professional medical setting, or that the dogs were simply wrong, reacting to decaying organic matter or old, unrelated biological material. The scientific community was divided, but the investigative result was clear. The evidence was dismissed. The DNA analysis of the samples collected from the car was deemed inconclusive, too degraded to form a perfect match. Though markers were present, the unseen witnesses had spoken, pointing toward a darker, more complex narrative involving death and concealment, but their testimony was ultimately silenced. The alerts were categorized as intelligence rather than proof, allowing the abduction theory to remain the dominant narrative. The dogs, who had no motive to lie, were effectively overruled by a system that preferred the uncertainty of a missing child to the grim finality of a crime scene alert. If the dogs represented the biological truth that could not speak, the Tapas 7 represented the human truth that refused to speak. This group of 7 friends, intelligent, professional, and wealthy, stood at the epicenter of the case. They were the last people to see Madeleine alive, the guardians of the timeline, and the architects of the evening's routine. Yet, as the years have unspooled, their role has transformed from grieving witnesses to a fortress of silence, impenetrable to the outside world. From the very beginning, the dynamic of the group was unusual. In the immediate aftermath of the disappearance, one might expect a fractured, chaotic response from a group of friends subjected to intense police pressure. Instead, the Tapas 7 presented a united front that bordered on the strategic. A now infamous statement made by one of the members, David Payne, set the tone for their interaction with the media and the public. "This is our matter." This declaration was not merely a request for privacy. It was a boundary line. It signaled that the group would handle the crisis internally, channeling all information through Jerry McCann. This coordination raised uncomfortable questions. In most investigations involving multiple witnesses, police rely on the natural variances in human memory to find the truth. They look for the small contradictions that reveal reality. With the Tapas 7, the narrative was strikingly consistent, and where it was not, the inconsistencies were never aggressively challenged. They were treated with a deference rarely afforded to witnesses in a potential homicide or negligence case. The most glaring example of this protective shield occurred when Portuguese authorities attempted to organize a reconstruction of the events. A reconstruction is a standard and vital investigative tool. It requires witnesses to physically return to the scene, walk through their movements, and demonstrate the timing of their actions. It allows investigators to see if the timeline is physically possible, if a person could truly walk from point A to point B in the time claimed, or if a line of sight was actually clear. When the request was made, the Tapas 7 refused. They cited various reasons: work commitments, the trauma of returning, and legal advice. Without their participation, the reconstruction was cancelled. This refusal was a devastating blow to the investigation. It meant that the timeline of that night, the 30-minute intervals, the listening at doors, the sightings in the dark, was never stress-tested in the real world. The witnesses were allowed to opt out of the very process designed to verify their accounts. For 17 years, this circle has remained unbroken. No member of the group has broken ranks to sell a story to the press. No one has come forward with a recovered memory or a correction to their original statement. In the world of true crime, such disciplined silence is an anomaly. Usually, under the pressure of guilt, time, or money, alliances fracture. Here, the loyalty has been absolute. Even more perplexing is the lack of engagement from the current investigators. Since German authorities identified Christian Bruckner as the prime suspect in 2020, there has been no public indication that the Tapas 7 have been re-interviewed. If Bruckner is the answer, then the timeline established by the friends is the key to proving his guilt or innocence. Did they see him? Was the open door they reported consistent with his methods? The fact that these witnesses have not been hauled back into the interrogation room suggests a systemic reluctance to disturb the foundation they built in 2007. The Tapas 7 remain the gatekeepers of the night's secrets. Their silence is often interpreted as the dignity of innocent people traumatized by a tragedy. But to the skeptical eye, it resembles something else: a pact, a collective agreement to maintain a version of events that protects the group, even if it leaves the mystery of the missing child unresolved. They are the only ones who know exactly what happened at the dinner table and during those lonely walks to the apartments, and they have chosen, collectively and decisively, to keep that knowledge within the circle. The disappearance of a child in a foreign land is, by definition, a consular matter. Governments typically provide support, offer translation services, and assist families in navigating the alien bureaucracy of a strange legal system. However, what transpired in the days and weeks following the vanishing of Madeleine McCann was not standard consular assistance. It was an intervention of such scale and swiftness that it fundamentally altered the nature of the investigation, transforming a local criminal inquiry into a geopolitical chess match, where the truth was often outmaneuvered by diplomacy. The first signal that this case would operate under a different set of rules was the arrival of Clarence Mitchell. In the ordinary course of events, a missing child does not warrant the deployment of a senior government media advisor. Mitchell, who had served as the director of the media monitoring unit for the British government, was dispatched to Praia da Luz to manage the press. His role quickly evolved from a government liaison into the personal spokesman for the McCann family. This blurred line between a state official and a private family representative created a powerful machinery of information control. The narrative was no longer being shaped solely by the evidence found by police. It was being curated by a professional focused on public perception. This machinery was not limited to media management. It extended into the highest corridors of power. Reports and later confirmations revealed that Gordon Brown, then the Chancellor of the Exchequer and soon to become the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, personally involved himself in the situation. He made direct contact with his counterparts in the Portuguese government. While publicly framed as a humanitarian gesture of concern for a British family, in diplomatic terms, this was a heavy hand on the shoulder of the Portuguese authorities. It signaled that the United Kingdom was watching, and more importantly, that it expected results that aligned with a specific outcome. The consequences of this political pressure were immediate and operational. One of the most contentious moments involved the release of a suspect sketch. Based on the testimony of Jane Tanner, who claimed to have seen a man carrying a child, the McCanns and their team pushed for the public release of an artist's impression. The Portuguese police, the Policia Judiciaria, resisted. Their protocols dictated that releasing a sketch based on a single, uncorroborated sighting in the dark, without a clear view of the face, could be disastrous. It could generate thousands of false leads, flood the phone lines, and allow the real perpetrator, if he existed, to slip away while the public hunted a phantom. Under normal circumstances, the police decision would stand, but under the weight of British political pressure, the protocol was broken. The sketch was released to the global media. As predicted by the investigators, it led to nothing but noise. The man in the sketch was never identified as a kidnapper, and years later, the sighting itself was largely discredited as a case of mistaken identity. Yet, the release demonstrated a shift in power. The investigation was no longer being led by the detectives on the ground, but by the demands of the political and media campaign operating above them. Perhaps the most disturbing aspect of this intervention was the data wall erected by British authorities. As the Portuguese police began to explore theories beyond a simple abduction, specifically theories that required looking at the family and their circle, they submitted formal requests for information held in the United Kingdom. They sought mobile phone records to verify the timeline of calls made on the night of the disappearance. They requested financial records to track credit card usage. They asked for medical histories. In a move that baffled the Portuguese detectives, the British Home Office refused or delayed many of these requests, citing privacy laws and the lack of formal suspect status for the individuals involved. The British government effectively shielded the data of the key witnesses from the very police force tasked with finding the missing child. This was a paradox of the highest order. The British government was publicly demanding that Portugal do everything to find Madeleine, while simultaneously withholding the digital and financial breadcrumbs that are the standard fuel of any modern investigation. The investigation was thus severed in two. The physical crime scene was in Portugal, but the digital lives of the people involved were in the United Kingdom, locked behind a fortress of bureaucracy and diplomatic protection. The Portuguese police were left to investigate a puzzle with half the pieces missing, fully aware that the entity withholding those pieces was the same one criticizing their lack of progress. The politics of intervention had not accelerated the path to justice. It had built a maze from which the truth struggled to escape. To understand why the Portuguese investigation into the disappearance of Madeleine McCann faltered, one must look beyond the events of 2007 and stare into the shadow of 2004. The Portuguese police force, specifically the Polícia Judiciária in the Algarve region, was not operating in a vacuum. They were operating under the haunting legacy of the Joana Cipriano case, a tragedy that had traumatized the local justice system and left the police vulnerable to a specific type of psychological warfare. 3 years prior to Madeleine's disappearance, young Joana Cipriano vanished from a village just a few miles from Praia da Luz. The similarities were superficial, but the outcome was brutal. In that case, the police concluded that the child had lost her life at the hands of her mother and uncle. The investigation was aggressive, relying heavily on interrogation. The mother eventually confessed, but she later retracted her statement, claiming it had been forced out of her. Photographs showing visible injuries circulated in the press, igniting a firestorm of controversy. The fallout was catastrophic for the reputation of the police. Several officers were accused of severe coercion and falsifying documents. Although the legal outcomes were complex, the damage was done. The narrative that solidified in the public consciousness was that the Algarve police were corrupt, incompetent, and prone to coercing confessions from innocent parents to close cases quickly. When Goncalo Amaral and his team arrived at apartment 5A in 2007, this ghost was standing in the room with them. They were acutely aware that the world was watching, and that the British media, armed with the history of the Cipriano case, was ready to destroy them at the slightest misstep. This fear of repeating history created a paralysis that the perpetrators, whoever they were, likely benefited from. The media weaponized the Cipriano case with ruthless efficiency. Every time the Portuguese police questioned the inconsistencies in the McCann's timeline or the lack of forensic evidence for an abduction, the British press would counterattack by invoking the memory of the mistreated mother from 2004. The implication was clear. You made a mistake then, and you are making a mistake now. You are targeting the parents because you are incompetent, not because the evidence leads there. This pressure forced the police into a defensive crouch. Standard investigative techniques, such as separating the parents for intensive, simultaneous interrogation, were delayed or softened. The aggressive pursuit of contradictions, a staple of homicide work, was treated as a diplomatic insult. The investigators were walking on eggshells, terrified that any rigorous questioning would be spun by the media campaign as harassment or persecution of a grieving family. The specter of the Cipriano case also affected the judicial oversight. Judges and prosecutors, wary of another international scandal, were hesitant to sign off on warrants or authorize intrusive surveillance without overwhelming proof that was impossible to gather because the initial investigation had been so gentle. It was a vicious cycle of hesitation. Ultimately, the ghost of the past claimed its victim, Goncalo Amaral, the coordinator of the investigation who had begun to theorize that Madeleine had died in the apartment, was removed from the case. His removal was widely seen as a capitulation to the external pressure. With his departure, the theory of involvement was effectively shelved, and the investigation reverted to the safer, politically acceptable narrative of abduction, a narrative that required no uncomfortable questions to be asked of the people in the room. The Portuguese police had been effectively neutralized not by the complexity of the crime, but by their own history. The fear of being branded as corrupt once again led them to be overly cautious, and in the world of criminal investigation, caution is often fatal to the truth. The ghost of Joanna Cipriano did not just haunt the police station. It shielded the investigation of 2007 from the rigors of scrutiny, ensuring that the hard questions remained unasked and the dark corners of the case remained unlit. In the history of modern crime, few cases have demonstrated the power of the press, quite like the disappearance of Madeleine McCann. Yet, to call it press coverage is a misunderstanding of the mechanics at play. What emerged in the days following, May 3, 2007, was not merely reporting. It was the construction of an engine, a sophisticated, relentless, and highly professionalized media machine that would come to define the narrative of the case as much as the evidence itself. Typically, when a child goes missing, the radius of attention is local. It expands slowly, mile by mile, driven by the desperation of the family and the resources of the police. In this case, that natural law was inverted. Within 72 hours, the face of Madeleine McCann was not just on the lampposts of Praia da Luz. It was on the front pages of newspapers in London, New York, Sydney, and Berlin. The speed of this globalization was unprecedented. It bypassed the usual filters of international news and landed directly in the living rooms of the world. This phenomenon was not accidental. It was the result of a strategy that merged public grief with professional public relations. Very early in the investigation, the McCann family was surrounded by a phalanx of advisors, including crisis management experts and top-tier legal representatives. The campaign to find Madeleine became a brand, complete with a logo, a dedicated fund, and a merchandising operation. While the stated goal was undeniably noble to keep the child's image in the public eye, the side effect was a total saturation that drowned out nuance. The media machine operated on a binary principle: good versus evil. The parents were cast as the quintessential victims, dignified, suffering, and above suspicion. The abductor was cast as a faceless perpetrator, a mystery man who could vanish through walls. This narrative was potent and emotionally overwhelming. It created a climate where questioning the abduction theory was equated to attacking the grieving family. Journalists who attempted to explore the inconsistencies in the witness statements or the forensic alerts found themselves swimming against a tidal wave of public sentiment. Crucially, this machine served as a shield. When the Portuguese police began to shift their focus toward the family in September of 2007, designating them as arguidos or formal suspects, the British media response was ferocious. The detectives were mocked, their methods were derided, and their integrity was assaulted on a daily basis. The narrative frame shifted from police hunting a kidnapper to incompetent foreign police persecuting innocent British citizens. This pressure cooker environment made it nearly impossible for the investigators to work without looking over their shoulders. But the machine had a harder edge than just headlines. It wielded the law as a weapon. A strategy of aggressive litigation was deployed against media outlets, journalists, and even the former lead investigator, Goncalo Amaral. When Amaral published a book detailing his theory that Madeleine had died in the apartment and that the abduction was a cover-up, the legal retaliation was swift. Injunctions were sought, lawsuits were filed, and financial damages were demanded. The message sent to the world was chillingly clear. If you deviate from the official narrative of abduction, you will face ruin. This libel tourism silenced legitimate journalistic inquiry. Major news networks became terrified of airing anything that could be construed as defamatory, leading to a sanitized version of events being repeated for years. The questions that should have been asked about the cadaver dogs, the changing timelines, the refusal to attend reconstructions were whispered in online forums but absent from the evening news. The media machine achieved its primary objective. It kept Madeleine famous. But in doing so, it may have compromised the very truth it claimed to seek. By rigidly controlling the story, by punishing dissent, and by allowing only one theory to breathe, the machine ensured that the investigation would be fought not in the evidence room, but in the court of public opinion, a court where emotion always overrules fact. While the media machine was busy shaping the world's opinion, a quiet tragedy was unfolding in the laboratories where the physical evidence of the case was stored. Forensic science is often viewed as the ultimate arbiter of truth, cold, objective, and undeniable. In the early stages of the inquiry, forensic technicians collected hundreds of samples from apartment 5A and the rental vehicle used by the parents. Many of these samples were complex. They were not simple, single-source stains of blood or saliva. They were mixtures, biological puzzles containing the DNA of 2, 3, or more individuals. In 2007, the technology to unravel these complex mixtures was limited. The results came back with the most frustrating label in criminology: inconclusive. The report stated that, while there were markers that could belong to Madeleine in the trunk of the car, the sample was too degraded and too mixed to say for certain. It was a statistical gray area. For the defense, inconclusive meant innocent. For the police, it meant a dead end. The samples were boxed up, and the investigation moved on. However, science does not stand still. In the years that followed, a revolution occurred in DNA analysis. A new technology known as probabilistic genotyping emerged. This method uses advanced algorithms and immense computing power to separate complex DNA mixtures that human analysts cannot read. It can look at a degraded smudge of biological material and mathematically pull apart the strands, identifying the contributors with a likelihood ratio in the billions. Enter Dr. Mark Perlin, a world-renowned expert in this field and the creator of the True Allele system. His technology had been used to solve cold cases, exonerate the wrongly convicted, and identify victims of mass disasters where only fragments remained. Perlin looked at the McCann case and saw a solvable problem. He believed that the inconclusive samples from the car and the apartment could be reanalyzed to provide a definitive answer. Dr. Perlin made an extraordinary offer. He offered to process the DNA data from the McCann case for free. He did not need the physical samples, which might have been destroyed or degraded further. He only needed the electronic data files generated by the original lab tests. It was a non-invasive, zero-cost, purely mathematical process. The implications of this offer were staggering. If Perlin's computer found no trace of Madeleine in the car, it would be a powerful vindication for the parents, scientifically dismantling the theory that they had moved her body. If, however, it confirmed her DNA was present in a vehicle rented 24 days after she vanished, it would be the smoking gun that changed everything. One would assume that an investigation desperate for a breakthrough would seize this opportunity with both hands. One would assume that parents longing to clear their names would demand this test be done immediately. Instead, there was silence. The offer was communicated to the British authorities. It was communicated to the McCann team. It was ignored. No data was sent. No permission was granted. The technology that had unlocked the secrets of the World Trade Center and grim homicide cases across America was shut out of the McCann investigation. This refusal is the single most haunting silence in the case. It defies logic. Why leave a question mark hanging over the evidence when a period could be placed at the end of the sentence? The rejection of the DNA offer suggests a terrifying possibility: that the people in charge of the case, whether the family, the police, or the politicians, had reached a point where they feared the answer more than they desired the solution. The science was there. The tool was on the table. But it was left behind, gathering dust, while the investigation chased shadows in the desert. The inconclusive result remains the official stance, not because it is the truth, but because it is the only safe place left to hide. In the timeline of unsolved mysteries, there is often a moment when the silence becomes unbearable for the authorities. When a case remains open for over a decade, it transforms from an investigation into a badge of institutional failure. In the disappearance of Madeleine McCann, that moment arrived in June of 2020. After years of dead ends, false sightings, and the gradual fading of public interest, the world was suddenly presented with a new face, a new name, and a new certainty. The German prosecutor's office in Braunschweig made an announcement that sent shockwaves through the global media. They identified a 43-year-old German national, Christian Bruckner, as the prime suspect. Unlike previous persons of interest who were merely questioned, the language used here was stark and definitive. The prosecutors stated they had concrete evidence that Madeleine was dead and that Bruckner was responsible. For the first time, a law enforcement agency was treating the case not as a missing person inquiry, but as a homicide investigation. On paper, Christian Bruckner was the perfect villain. He was a drifter who had lived a transient life in the Algarve between 1995 and 2007. He resided in a farmhouse just miles from the Ocean Club resort. His criminal record was extensive, involving burglary, drug offenses, and other serious moral crimes. He drove an old camper van, a vehicle that fit the profile of a mobile hideout. He was already in prison for a separate crime, meaning he was a safe target for accusation. He had no powerful friends, no political influence, and no public sympathy. However, as the dust settled on the explosive headlines, the cracks in this new theory began to widen. The German authorities claimed to have evidence, yet they made a public appeal for information. This is a paradox in criminal justice. If you have the evidence to prove guilt, you indict the suspect. If you are appealing to the public for help, it usually means your case is circumstantial and weak. Months turned into years. 2021 passed, then 2022. Despite the bold initial claims, no arrest warrant for the murder of Madeleine McCann was ever issued. Bruckner remained in his cell for other offenses. But the concrete evidence regarding the missing British child was never presented to a grand jury or a court. When pressed by journalists, the prosecutors admitted a damaging truth. They did not have a body. They did not have a weapon of offense. And they did not have DNA linking him to the crime scene. Their case relied heavily on the testimony of a former acquaintance who claimed Bruckner had made a drunken confession years after the fact, a type of evidence known to be notoriously unreliable. The narrative began to look less like a breakthrough and more like a strategy. By naming Bruckner, the authorities achieved several administrative goals. They revitalized the investigation, justifying further funding. They shifted the focus away from the uncomfortable questions regarding the timeline and the original suspects. And, perhaps most cynically, they provided a focal point for public anger. Bruckner became a lightning rod. Whether he did it or not mattered less than the fact that he could have done it. Defense attorneys and legal analysts began to ask the hard questions. Was Bruckner truly the mastermind behind the century's most famous disappearance? Or was he simply the most convenient scapegoat available? He was a man with a vile past, certainly, But being a criminal does not automatically make one guilty of every unsolved crime in the vicinity. The timeline of his movements was fuzzy. His phone was pinged near the resort, but near in a small village can mean miles away. The evidence was circumstantial, the kind that crumbles under the weight of a courtroom trial. As of 2024, Christian Bruckner has not been charged with the abduction of Madeleine McCann. He remains a suspect in name, only a placeholder in the files. His existence allows the German, British, and Portuguese authorities to say the case is active and solved in theory, without ever having to prove it in practice. He is the convenient suspect, guilty enough to satisfy the headlines, but not guilty enough to face a judge. If the naming of Christian Bruckner was the headline, the search operations that followed were the spectacle. In May of 2023, the world turned its eyes once again to Portugal, specifically to the Arade Dam, a remote reservoir located roughly 30 miles from Praia da Luz. The German authorities, acting on credible intelligence, launched the largest search operation seen in the case for years. The scene at the reservoir was designed for visual impact. Heavy machinery rolled into the scrubland. Police boats patrolled the water. Divers submerged into the murky depths. Drones buzzed overhead, capturing high-definition footage for the nightly news. Tents were erected, and areas were cordoned off with the recognizable tape of a major crime scene. For 3 days, the operation dominated the news cycle. The imagery was powerful, law enforcement finally taking action, finally digging for the truth. But beneath the surface of this activity, the operation felt hollow. The intelligence that led them there was reportedly based on the same dubious sources that had pointed to Bruckner years earlier, claims that he had once called the reservoir his little paradise. There was no specific tip about a body location, no new witness coming forward with a map. It was a search based on a hunch, conducted 17 years too late. The logistics of the search were also puzzling. The Portuguese police, who know the terrain better than anyone, appeared to be taking a back seat, observing rather than leading. The British detectives were present, but operational power lay with the Germans. It was a disjointed effort, a collision of jurisdictions on a muddy bank. As the days wore on, the frantic energy of the digging began to slow. Bags were carried out, but they did not contain bones or clothes. They contained soil samples and scraps of fabric that could have belonged to any camper or hiker from the last 2 decades. When the machines finally stopped and the tents were packed away, the official statement was crushing in its brevity. Nothing of significance was found. A year later, in 2024, a similar scene played out in another location with similar results. These operations began to resemble theater more than investigation. In the world of public relations, this is known as performative action. When authorities are under pressure to show progress but have no new leads, they must be seen to be doing something. A massive search, even a futile one, demonstrates commitment. It tells the public, "We have not forgotten." It fills the airtime and suggests that the police are closing in. However, for those familiar with the case details, the reservoir search was a distraction. It moved the attention 30 miles away from apartment 5A. It moved the conversation away from the inconsistencies of the Tapas 7, the cadaver dog alerts in the apartment, and the refused DNA tests. It focused the narrative entirely on the stranger in the woods theory. The theater of excavation served its purpose. It reinforced the idea that the answer lies buried in the Portuguese wilderness, hidden by a monster, rather than hidden in the files of the police or the silence of the witnesses. The dirt was turned, the money was spent, and the cameras eventually left, leaving the reservoir as silent as it had been before. The investigation had moved the earth, but it had not moved the case forward by a single inch. The truth, it seemed, was not something that could be dug up with a shovel. In the idealized version of international justice, borders are merely lines on a map that dissolve when a child goes missing. Police forces from different nations are expected to link arms, sharing data, resources, and intelligence in a seamless pursuit of the truth. However, the investigation into the disappearance of Madeleine McCann has revealed a far more cynical reality. Instead of a unified front, the case has become a study in diplomatic friction and bureaucratic ego, involving three of Europe's most powerful nations: Portugal, the United Kingdom, and Germany. At the center of this dysfunctional triangle sits Portugal. As the location of the crime, the Portuguese judiciary police retain legal jurisdiction over the case. Technically, it is their file, their crime scene, and their responsibility. However, since the early controversies of 2007, their authority has been systematically eroded. Following the media backlash and the removal of their lead investigator, the Portuguese authorities retreated into a defensive silence. They became the host of an investigation that was increasingly being directed by foreign powers. They possess the physical archives, the original witness statements, the forensic reports from the apartment, and the local intelligence, but they have been effectively sidelined from the decision-making table. To the north lies the United Kingdom. Driven by immense public pressure and political lobbying, the British government launched Operation Grange, a task force within Scotland Yard dedicated solely to this case. This operation has cost millions of pounds and employed dozens of detectives. Yet, for all its resources, Operation Grange has no executive power on Portuguese soil. British detectives cannot arrest suspects, interview witnesses, or conduct searches in Praia da Luz without the explicit permission and presence of their Portuguese counterparts. This created a cumbersome request system, where every action required paperwork, translation, and diplomatic approval. Worse still, the flow of information was often one way. While Britain demanded access to Portuguese files, they were accused of withholding intelligence regarding the background of the individuals involved, creating a climate of mistrust. Then, in 2020, Germany entered the fray, when the prosecutor in Braunschweig announced Christian Bruckner as the prime suspect. They effectively seized the narrative, but they did not integrate their investigation with the existing ones. Instead, Germany operated in a silo. They claimed to hold evidence that neither London nor Lisbon had seen. Reports emerged that German investigators had not shared the full details of their concrete evidence with Scotland Yard or the Portuguese Judiciary Police. They were running a parallel investigation, keeping their cards close to their chest to prevent leaks. The result is a tri-nation gridlock. You have Portugal holding the crime scene but lacking the political capital to lead. You have the United Kingdom holding the funding and the victim's history, but lacking jurisdiction. And you have Germany holding the suspect, but refusing to show their hand. There is no central command. There is no single room where all the evidence, from the timeline inconsistencies to the DNA reports to the suspect's movements, is laid out on one table. This fragmentation serves the perpetrator perfectly. A criminal relies on the gaps in the system to survive. In this case, the gaps are the borders themselves. Evidence that might look insignificant to a German detective might be the missing key for a Portuguese investigator who walked the streets of Praia da Luz in 2007. But if those two detectives never speak, the connection is never made. The investigation is not failing because of a lack of effort. It is failing because it is being fought by three armies who refuse to share their maps. In criminal law, there is a vast canyon between knowing and proving. A prosecutor may know in their gut, or even from intelligence reports, that a suspect is guilty, but proving it beyond a reasonable doubt in a court of law requires a chain of evidence that is unbroken and undeniable. For the last few years, the Madeleine McCann case has been trapped in this canyon, stuck in a legal stalemate that feels increasingly permanent. When the German authorities declared Christian Bruckner the man responsible, they used language that implied an endgame was near. They spoke of a murder investigation and material evidence. The public expected an indictment to follow within weeks. Instead, months turned into years, and the silence from the prosecutor's office grew deafening. This hesitation points to a critical weakness in the case. The evidence, whatever it is likely circumstantial. Circumstantial evidence is a collection of indirect facts: a van seen in the area, a cell phone pinging a tower, a history of similar crimes. While compelling, it does not place the suspect in the room. It does not prove he took the child. Without a confession, a body, or forensic traces linking Bruckner directly to Madeleine, any defense lawyer would dismantle the case in court. The German prosecutors are trapped. If they charge him now and lose, double jeopardy laws would prevent them from ever trying him again, even if new evidence emerged later. So, they wait. Complicating this stalemate is the issue of the statute of limitations. In Portugal, the statute of limitations for serious crimes like homicide is generally 15 years. By May of 2022, that deadline was approaching. To prevent the case from legally expiring, Portuguese authorities hurriedly declared Bruckner and Arguido a formal suspect. This was a procedural move to stop the clock, not a sign of new evidence. It was a legal paperwork exercise designed to keep the file alive on a technicality. This situation has created a bizarre legal purgatory. Bruckner sits in a German prison for unrelated crimes, serving as a ghost prisoner for the McCann case. He has not been charged, yet he has been publicly branded as the killer by state officials. This challenges the very presumption of innocence. If he is never charged, he will forever remain the man who got away with it in the eyes of the public, even if he is innocent of this specific crime. Conversely, if he is guilty, he is currently waiting out the clock, banking on the fact that the three nations cannot stitch together enough scraps of proof to convict him. The stalemate is also a form of cruelty for the family. A trial offers a conclusion. A verdict offers a defined ending, whether it is the one hoped for or not. But this indefinite suspension, where a suspect is named but not tried, where the case is solved by press release but not by a jury, offers no closure. It is a state of suspended animation. The legal systems of Europe have built a cage around the case, but they have locked themselves inside it. They cannot move forward without risking a loss, and they cannot retreat without admitting defeat. And so, the file sits on a desk, gathering dust, while the question of justice remains frozen in time. In the architecture of any criminal investigation, there is usually a hierarchy of probability. Detectives start with the most likely explanation, often the one involving those closest to the center, and work outward toward the improbable. However, in the disappearance of Madeleine McCann, this pyramid was inverted. The investigation began with the assumption of the most complex and statistically rare scenario: a stranger abduction. To maintain this theory for 17 years, authorities have had to navigate around a series of logical and forensic obstacles that point persistently toward a different, far more uncomfortable hypothesis. This alternative hypothesis posits that there was no intruder. It suggests that Madeleine died within apartment 5A, likely as the result of a tragic accident, and that the ensuing events were a panic-driven effort to conceal that reality. While this theory is distressing to contemplate, it is the only narrative that aligns with the specific forensic alerts triggered by the victim recovery dogs. As previously detailed, the cadaver dog, trained to ignore live human scent and food waste, alerted to the scent of mortality behind the sofa and in the bedroom. If no body had been in that apartment, the presence of that specific scent is scientifically inexplicable. The logistics of the stranger abduction theory, when examined without emotion, crumble under scrutiny. For an abductor to succeed, they would have needed to watch the apartment for days to learn the checking routine. They would have needed to enter through a window that showed no definitive tool marks of forced entry. They would have needed to navigate a dark room, select the specific child, and exit through a small window while carrying a sleeping victim, all without waking the others in the same room. They would have had to do this without leaving a single fiber, a hair, a fingerprint, or a footprint. And they would have had to accomplish this entire operation in the narrow window of time between checks. The precision required is akin to a military operation. Yet the profile of the suspects, drifters, burglars, opportunists, suggests disorganized criminality. Furthermore, there is the matter of language. In the early days of the investigation, specific phrases used by the family raised eyebrows among behavioral analysts. One particular comment attributed to Kate McCann became a focal point for those questioning the abduction narrative. When discussing the possibility of police searching the rental car, she reportedly questioned whether the police were looking for the body. For a mother maintaining the absolute belief that her daughter was alive and missing, the use of definitive, final language regarding human remains was seen by some as a psychological slip, a moment where the subconscious knowledge of death surfaced in speech. Why, then, has this hypothesis been so aggressively sidelined? The answer may lie in the implications. If the abduction theory is false, it means that the resources of 3 nations, millions of pounds in public funds, and the sympathy of the global public were directed at a mirage. It implies a failure of the Portuguese police to secure the initial scene, a failure of the British government to vet the case before intervening, and a failure of the media to ask basic questions. The abduction theory is clean. It places the blame on an external criminal. The alternative theory is messy. It casts a shadow on the parents, the friends, and the system that protected them. To accept the uncomfortable hypothesis is to accept that the mystery is not a mystery of who took her, but a mystery of how a group of people managed to keep a secret for nearly 2 decades. It requires accepting that the silence of the Tapas 7, the refusal of the reconstruction, and the rejection of the DNA tests were not acts of privacy, but acts of survival. The evidence for this theory is not a single smoking gun, but a collection of whispers. The dog alerts, the timeline gaps, the lack of forced entry, and the statistical impossibility of the perfect crime. It is the hypothesis that no one wants to be true, which is precisely why it has been the hardest one to investigate. As the timeline extends beyond the 17-year mark, the disappearance of Madeleine McCann has transformed from an active emergency into a historical artifact. The files held in Lisbon, London, and Braunschweig are thick with reports, but they are thin on progress. The case is no longer defined by the hunt for a child, but by the inertia of the institutions that failed to find her. We are witnessing not just a cold case, but a deliberate, systemic decision to forget the complexities of the truth in favor of a simplified, unresolved ending. The legacy of this investigation is a masterclass in bureaucratic paralysis. The silent triangle of Portugal, the United Kingdom, and Germany has created a structure where accountability is impossible. Portugal cannot close the case without admitting their initial investigation was sabotaged by politics. The United Kingdom cannot withdraw support without facing questions about why they protected suspects and withheld data. Germany cannot drop the suspect, Christian Bruckner, without admitting their concrete evidence was a bluff. And so, the 3 nations are locked in a perpetual embrace, holding the case up just high enough to say it is open, but low enough to ensure it never moves forward. The cost of this paralysis is measured not just in the tens of millions of pounds spent on Operation Grange and international searches, but in the erosion of public trust. The world watched as a 2-tier justice system was exposed. One tier exists for the wealthy and well-connected, where prime ministers intervene, media managers are appointed, and suspects are allowed to refuse questions. Another tier exists for everyone else, where police occupy the scene, separate the witnesses, and follow the evidence wherever it leads, regardless of reputation. In the end, the story of Madeleine McCann is likely not a story of a perfect crime. Perfect crimes do not exist. There is always a trace. There is always a memory. The truth of what happened that night in apartment 5 resides in the minds of the people who were there. It is locked away in the conscience of the Tapas 7, in the memory of the parents, and perhaps in the overlooked files of the police. It is not missing. It is merely unread. The decision to forget is a protective mechanism. It protects the tourism industry of the Algarve, which wants to move past the stigma of a child snatcher. It protects the reputations of the politicians who staked their careers on the innocence of the family. It protects the police forces from the humiliation of admitting they were outmaneuvered. But this protection comes at a price. The price is justice for a victim who was failed entirely. As the cameras finally turn away and the funding eventually dries up, the file will likely remain on a shelf, officially open but functionally closed. The mystery will be preserved in amber, a tragic puzzle that the world is no longer allowed to solve. But the silence that surrounds the case is not empty. It is heavy with the weight of the unanswered. Madeleine McCann did not just vanish into the dark. She was obscured by the fog of human error, pride, and politics. And until someone within that circle decides that the burden of the truth is heavier than the fear of the consequences, she will remain lost not in the physical world, but in the shadow of the secrets that were kept to save everyone but her.